Hello again, Steve here, and today I wanted to talk a little bit about what I heard somebody say very recently, which I thought was pretty profound. It got me to thinking anyway, so I don't know if that's very profound. But as you may have remembered me talking about this guy before, Stefan Molyneux. If you're not familiar with him, look the guy up, freedomain.com or on YouTube or something like that. Check some of his stuff out. The guy is amazing as a thinker, I would say. So, and of course, he's lied about by the mainstream media a lot. So he's in Wikipedia and whatnot. So that's also gives him a lot of credence in my mind. Now, he said something like this: all successful organizations get taken over by psychopaths eventually. And while I don't know if that's true to all of them, it is very often the case. And bear in mind now, these are not necessarily psychopaths who are deliberate psychopaths who want to ruin everybody's life or whatever. It's just the nature. I think it's a nature. It's like an inner psychopath within most of us. I mean, I would count myself as that. This is the character within us who wants expediency to basically push away, principles or morals or something like that. Oh, that piece of cheesecake looks really good and it tastes really good. Therefore, I'm just going to eat it because of that. It's like the cat who wants to catch another mouse even though he's already full just so he can play with the mouse until it dies. It's unnecessary and it's harmful. It's harmful to the mouse and so on. Eating that extra piece of cheesecake, if it's not doing us any physiological good, it's actually doing us harm, you could say, but it feels good in the moment. That's kind of like the inner psychopath who takes advantage, who's a bit of a grifter, who's an opportunist and what have you, right? So this nature within us and this nature within people within society results in what I'm going to call here entropy. And entropy, I think, is usually I'm not going to give any sort of a professorial, if that's a term, sort of a breakdown of the word, because I ain't no professor, shall we say. But I'm going to use a more common definition for it in terms of a practical approach here, which is the gradual decline into disorder. It's sort of like the nature of what it is that we want to create. Like we build a house, right? If you just leave the house alone, eventually the paint washes off of it, the roof gets all curled up, birds live into the soffits and mice come in and stuff like that. Nature wants to push it back down to, well, you could say it's an order. It's the it's the order of nature, but it's not the order that we want. We want to have a maintained house. So we constantly have to put efforts in to maintain it. Otherwise, it'll on its own, basically, it'll just return to nature, essentially. And as far as we're concerned, that's disorder. And you see that with the example of people who will build up a business, say a dad and sons, like John Brown and Sons, right? Well, when he dies away and it's just the sons, sometimes it just goes for shit because they are more psychopathic than he is. They don't necessarily know about all the little things that he was doing based on principle to keep that going, the maintenance that had to be done, the goodwill towards the customers and so on, whereas they were just living off of the opportunity because they were there in the mix when he built that, right? And so we see this, once again, coming back to the lesson for us. The lesson for us is for that inner psychopath to rear its head and for us to be aware of it. Be aware of it. But also, we see that within our societies. We see the decline of institutions and so on as a result of this, right? And like I say again, that the psychopath is the one who takes for himself without the consideration of long-term consequences. That inner self that eats that cheesecake without the consideration of how we're going to feel later. For example, I just ate some kind of a brownie that I was out driving somewhere and I found that it was anything that I saw that was eatable in this little corner store. And I regret it now. I regret it because I didn't need to eat it. I could have just stayed a little bit hungry. And but I kind of knew in a way that was the wrong thing to do. That's that kind of inner psychopath in a way, right? Not to consider the long term, or not to consider others, which is also the long term because it's our relationships and what have you, right? And other ways we notice this within ourselves is how we can allow for the momentary expediency to let our desktop get cluttered, or our house get cluttered, or the screen on our computer to get all cluttered up. Part of us knows, that other self within us, that more principled self, knows that eventually we got to clean this shit up because it's just going to be it's going to get out of control, right? But in the moment, we leave it, right? And that's something to be aware of. And I've noticed this over the years in organizations, for sure, and I've brought these examples up before, but for practical purposes, I'll bring them up again. Been involved with Toastmasters for many, many years. And what I noticed is that when you had a few or even one principled individual in there who would be dedicated to the mission of what it is that the club was trying to do, you would have a smoothly running, quality club, right? And what would happen is that other clubs around that would fail because people who weren't so inclined weren't running their clubs properly, they would fail. And a few people within those clubs would show up in the good running club. Now you might ask, why didn't they just stay in their club and fix it, get it going again? Well, it's because of the expediency, once again, that entropy nature within them that's stronger than the principled side, which to allow things to crumble and just go and take the opportunity where it is, be an opportunist and jump on the bandwagon of something else that is running properly. Like John Brown and Sons, when his company goes down, they don't decide to sell or whatever, they just see that the money's flowing in, so they keep going, right? But eventually it falls apart. And what happens with these clubs, these Toastmasters clubs, is when these people come in, and eventually when that one or those several people who were running that club really well move on, well, the thing goes into a spiral. Absolutely, because the nature of who they are comes in, right? And also, so you see that people move in, people who are more or less driven by psychopathy, or grifting, or this opportunistic approach. This, as my brother-in-law in Mexico says, the easy money, man. You know, that sort of mentality. You see that in very large organizations, like the United States is a good example. The United States started as probably one of the greatest experiments in the history of humanity in human emancipation, the emancipation of man. You had these founding fathers who set up a very strong document, which was to put the individual as sovereign, right? And because of that, there was this great flourishing of freedom and a huge amount of prosperity. Well, that didn't last forever, because whenever there's lots of prosperity, in moves the grifting psychopaths to mooch off of that, right? In moved back in the Bar Association. And these organizations, which as far as I understand it, the Bar of the British Accredited Registry was banned from the US in its early years because they knew it was just a royal institution that took advantage and mooching off the people. It moved back in and now it basically runs it, right? So you see that all the way from prosperity as it was to complete clown world now, running on fantasy and debt, which, you know, what was the saying again that Stefan Molyneux had? That all successful organizations eventually get taken over by psychopaths. And when they get taken over by psychopaths, eventually they just nosedive and collapse, like the company that the Suns run into the ground, right? And yeah, so, you know, in the latest news here, there's the UN running out of money. The UN, I mean, well, it was founded by, you could argue, certain psychopaths, at least people who had quite a bit of psychopathy. I would think that probably Franklin Delano Roosevelt was involved in setting that up, who is a communist and the whole works. But at least he was a hard worker. I don't think anybody could deny that. He wasn't as much of a grifting communist as some would be today with pink hair and so on. But anyways, it would have been the member states, at least the major ones, like the United States, for example, they would have been more fiscally sound at the time when it started, right? And more, so there's degrees. There's people who start off things very, very principled, and they become less principled, and therefore they fail. And there's ones that are somewhat principled, and they become outrageously unprincipled and they fail. And that's what we see in the UN. We see the UN as this house of cards which has not been maintained and which is now falling apart, and they're bankrupt, of course, and they're going to have to go asking for money. Well, what do we expect? When we have any kind of an organization that's taken over by psychopaths, it's going to fail. And psychopaths, once again, are those, they don't produce anything. They just grift off of. They're opportunists. They jump in. They don't care about the future. It's like, give me my orgasm now, and I'll worry about. I won't even worry about that at all later. Because, well, I will worry about it. I won't like it later, but I'm not thinking about later at this point. I'm just worrying about my own pocketbook in the moment. So as much as I can get out of this, the more. And I see that all the time, even in organizations. Usually the leaders within an organization, they're more principled. And then the further on down you go to the janitors and so on, they're less principled and therefore less successful, because they're more down around the state of nature, basically, which is what a term that used to be used for somebody who is basically infantile. And that is, I think, a good example of entropy, So anyway, something to think about. And the lesson, once again, here is for us, is to know and to recognize this nature within each and every one of us, possibly. And sometimes when we shine the light on a character trait of ourselves that is not benefiting us so much, it's easier for us to recognize it, first of all. And then once we can recognize something, it's easier for us to do something about it, right? It's like if we're lost in the woods, even if we know where we want to go, that's kind of irrelevant if we don't know where we are at the moment to plan the route from there. So, recognizing that may be the cause of some of our problems, this nature to want to, live for the moment and to hell with the future, to hell with where we're going, and just expediency in the moment is the nature that causes entropy, I would say. This state that returns everything to nature, as we would call it in our case, disorder. Steve here again, great chatting. If you like what I'm doing, please like, subscribe, and share, and we'll talk again soon. Bye for now.